The scar tissue on Rachel Brennan's left forearm caught the dim light as her fingers moved across the cold steel of the M4 rifle. The darkness of the supply room pressed in around her, broken only by the pale glow of her tablet screen. Her hands worked with mechanical precision, disassembling and reassembling the weapon, with the fluid certainty of 15 years of muscle memory. On the tablet, a photograph stared back at her. A younger version of herself, 23, and grinning arms slung around the shoulders of Sergeant David Morrison. Behind them, the skeletal remains of a building in Fallujah, 2009. Morrison's face was split wide with laughter, forever frozen in that moment of brotherhood and trust. Rachel's thumb hovered over the screen, then swiped. The next image made her jaw tighten. Twisted metal, blackened earth, a transfer case that had disintegrated under operational stress exactly as the maintenance logs had warned it would. Exactly as 3 separate technical inspections had flagged. Exactly as the commanding officer had ignored. The body bag and the final photograph bore a name tag she could recite in her sleep. Morrison David R. Sargent, U.S. Army. Her fingers traced the scar on her forearm, the raised tissue a permanent reminder of the explosion that had killed her best friend and left her with questions that would take 15 years to answer. Questions about accountability, about leadership, about the distance between what commanders said and what they knew to be true. Rachel closed the tablet with a soft click. She stood, her body moving through the darkness with practiced ease, and stepped toward the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor beyond. The supply room door opened with a metallic groan. She blinked against the brightness, her face settling into an expression of perfect neutrality. Specialist Rachel Brennan, according to the name tape on her uniform. Just another junior enlisted soldier passing through Forward Operating Base Viper, deep in the Arizona desert. Unremarkable, forgettable, exactly as she needed to be. The briefing tent was a cathedral of canvas and aluminum, its interior a cavern of bodies and anticipation. 500 soldiers packed the space shoulder to shoulder, their desert camouflage blending into a sea of tan and brown. The air tasted of dust and sweat and the metallic tang of equipment freshly cleaned. At the front of the formation, Colonel Frank Garrett commanded the space like a man born to it. He was all sharp angles and parade ground posture, his uniform pressed to knife-edge perfection, his voice an instrument of authority honed over 28 years of service. Behind him, a projection screen flickered with the pale blue glow of a PowerPoint presentation. Operational readiness stands at 98%. Garrett announced, his finger stabbing toward a slide filled with green icons arranged in neat columns. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. 98%. That is not a number. That is a statement. That is the standard we set and the standard we exceed. He paced before the screen, his shadow elongated and predatory in the projector's light. We are the tip of the spear. The spear does not bend. The spear does not break. The spear does not make excuses. In the back row, pressed against the canvas wall where the generator's hum was loudest, Rachel stood perfectly still. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her eyes tracked Garrett's movement with the same clinical attention she had applied to the rifle in the darkness. She noted the confidence in his stride, the way his gaze swept across the formation without truly seeing individual faces. The performance of a man convinced of his own narrative. We have a visitor with us today, Garrett continued, and for the first time his eyes found Rachel's corner of the tent. The look he gave her was dismissive, a glance that measured and discarded her in the same instant. Divisional Logistics has sent us an auditor. Specialist Brennan is here to verify our readiness, to check our boxes, to ensure our paperwork is as excellent as our performance. A ripple of barely suppressed amusement moved through the formation. Junior officers exchanged knowing glances. The implication was clear. Paperwork, an administrative formality, a clerk's work. Garrett's smile was tight and humorless. Let's make sure Specialist Brennan has nothing but full boxes to check. Give her access to whatever she needs. Let her see our perfect record and send her on her way with a glowing report. We have real work to do. Near the front, a thick-necked figure in sergeant first-class rank shifted his weight. Dale Kramer was a man built from slabs of muscle and coiled aggression. His face weathered by a decade of deployments and hardened by something darker beneath the surface. Former Ranger, Garrett's enforcer, the kind of NCO who confused volume with leadership and compliance with respect. Kramer's voice carried across the silent formation, pitched just loud enough to be heard by the soldiers around him. Probably can't even field strip an M9. Scattered chuckles. Rachel's expression didn't change. She absorbed the comment the way stone absorbs rain, letting it roll off without leaving a mark. Her eyes remained fixed on Garrett, cataloging, measuring, documenting. The briefing ended with another wave of motivational rhetoric, words about excellence and standards in the pride of the regiment. The formation broke like a dam, releasing water soldiers flooding toward the exits in a controlled chaos of movement and noise. Rachel remained motionless until the tent had emptied, leaving only the distant thrum of generators and the soft creak of canvas in the desert wind. A single figure approached from the front. Master Sergeant William Dockery moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had absorbed 3 decades of hard use and was making peace with its limitations. At 63, he was old for his rank, his face a topographic map of sun damage and stress, his eyes carrying the weight of too many deployments and too many compromises. "Specialist Brennan, Joe," he said, his voice like gravel rolling down a hill. "Colonel's expecting you to start with the striker platoon. Lieutenant Hammond will be your escort." Rachel turned to face him fully. When she spoke, her voice was low and even, with no trace of deference or challenge. Just statement. "I'd rather start with you, Master Sergeant, and I'd rather walk the line without an escort. I'll work better when people aren't standing over my shoulder." Dockery studied her with the kind of attention that came from decades of reading soldiers. He had seen hundreds of inspectors in his time. Most fell into 2 categories: the box checkers who cared only about completing their paperwork and leaving, the zealots who arrived looking to make a name for themselves by finding violations real or manufactured. This woman fit neither pattern. There was a stillness about her that was unusual for an E4, a quality of watchful patience that reminded him of snipers. He had known. "All right," he said slowly, the words careful and measured. "My motor pool. Follow me." They stepped from the tent into the crushing weight of afternoon heat. The sun hung overhead like a physical presence, turning the air into something solid and oppressive. The temperature gauge outside the command post read 112 degrees. The motor pool sprawled before them, a city of canvas shelters and concrete hardstands filled with the angular shapes of armored vehicles. The noise was constant and layered. The diesel throb of engines on test stands, the percussion of heavy wrenches against steel, the sharp hiss of pneumatic tools, the shouts of mechanics, and the clang of metal on metal. It was the sound of an organization in motion, of soldiers maintaining the machines that would carry them into harm's way. Dockery led her to the first vehicle, a M126 Stryker infantry carrier, sitting on a hardstand with its rear ramped down. The armor gleamed dully in the sunlight, recently washed, the 8 wheels standing in perfect alignment. "Alpha 7, Dockery said, gesturing with a thick hand. "Lieutenant Hammond's ride. Just came out of a full-service cycle. Clean bill of health." Rachel didn't pull out a clipboard. She didn't consult a technical manual. She moved around the vehicle with the focused attention of a surgeon examining a patient, her eyes tracking details that most observers would miss entirely. She knelt beside the front suspension assembly, her gloved fingers tracing the housing where the drive axle met the mounting bracket. The weld looked clean at first glance, the metal properly joined. But her fingers found what her eyes had already noted: a slight discoloration in the bolt head, a shape that was almost right but not quite. "This is a grade 5 bolt," she said, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. It wasn't a question. Dockery squinted at it, his brow furrowing. "It is." Rachel's fingers moved to the next bolt in the sequence, then the next. "All the same?" "All wrong." She stood, her eyes finding Dockery's face. "The technical manual specifies grade 8 for this housing. Higher tensile strength. 150,000 psi versus 120,000. Dockery's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're short on grade 8s. Supply chain's been backed up for months. A grade 5 will hold." "It'll hold on a paved road," Rachel said, her tone unchanged, clinical and precise. "It'll shear under the torque stress of a high-speed maneuver in deep sand or soft terrain, especially with the added weight of the counter-IED armor package. Lateral G-forces will exceed the bolt's shear strength. The mounting will fail. The suspension will collapse." She moved to the rear of the vehicle without waiting for a response, her attention already shifting to the next system. She knelt again, this time examining the power pack assembly where the engine met the transmission. Her eyes scanned the concrete beneath the vehicle, finding what she was looking for immediately. A dark stain, no larger than a quarter, glistened wetly on the concrete. Rachel touched it with one gloved finger, brought it close to her face, and inhaled. Her nose wrinkled slightly. You've got a weeping gasket on the coolant pump. Slow leak. Not enough to show on a drip pan during a 4-hour maintenance check. But over a long patrol in this heat, the engine will run hot. The system will try to compensate, putting additional strain on the turbocharger. Best case, you lose 20% of your power output. Worst case, you throw a rod and total the engine. Dockery said nothing. He knew about the gasket. He had 3 vehicles with the same issue and exactly 1 replacement part sitting in supply. He had logged the deficiency. The log, he knew, had been quietly edited to show the issue as resolved. They walked the line for 2 hours, moving from vehicle to vehicle under the merciless sun. At each stop, Rachel spoke in the same quiet voice, cataloging failures with the precision of a medical examiner performing an autopsy. Mismatched wiring harnesses on Alpha 3 that could cause electrical fires under load. Brake pads on Alpha 5 worn 3 millimeters past their service limit, compromising stopping distance by 30%. A communications antenna on Alpha 9 with hairline fractures that would kill long-range transmission in a sandstorm. Tire pressure monitoring systems disabled because the sensors had failed and no replacements were available. She didn't make accusations. She didn't question Dockery's competence or integrity. She simply stated facts, each observation delivered in the same level tone, building a structure of evidence, brick by brick. With each finding, Dockery's weariness transformed into something else. Grudging respect, perhaps? Or recognition. This was not a box checker reading from a manual. The manual was inside her, internalized so completely that she saw vehicles the way a master mechanic did, perceiving not what was, but what would be. The invisible cracks, the future failures, the gap between the digital readiness report and the physical reality of metal and hydraulics. At Alpha 12, Rachel stopped for longer than usual. The striker sat at the end of the line, its engine compartment open, a young specialist with grease-stained hands working inside. The vehicle's digital log, displayed on a ruggedized laptop mounted to the hull, showed all systems green, 100% mission capable. Rachel circled the vehicle slowly, her eyes scanning the undercarriage. She knelt and looked up into the belly of the machine, her headlamp cutting through the shadows. When she stood, her face was unreadable. The transfer case has been welded, she said. 3 separate welds by the look of it. The housing shows fatigue cracks radiating from the stress points. This component is at the end of its service life. The next time it goes, it won't be a simple breakdown. It's going to come apart catastrophically. Dockery's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. We've had a replacement on order for 6 weeks. Supply says it's coming. I've logged the issue multiple times. The logs don't show any of this, Rachel said, gesturing to the laptop screen with its cheerful display of green icons. The digital readiness report shows this vehicle as fully mission capable. 0 deficiencies. She tapped the screen with one gloved finger. This software is easy to manipulate. You can backdate entries, copy and paste service records from other vehicles. Edit timestamps. It's clean, but it's not right. Dockery looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw the war between what he knew and what he was allowed to say. Garrett's pushing for his star, he said, more to himself than to her. He thinks readiness reports are what gets you promoted. He doesn't understand that the truth comes out one way or another, usually the hard way. It always does, Rachel agreed. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of boots on concrete, sharp and purposeful. Lieutenant Christopher Hammond approached with the eager stride of a young officer still convinced the world would reward his enthusiasm. He was 26, West Point educated, with the kind of clean-cut features that look good in recruiting posters. Behind him, moving with the coiled menace of a predator, came Sergeant First Class Dale Kramer. Master Sergeant, Hammond said, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone trying very hard to sound commanding. The colonel wants a word. Now. He barely acknowledged Rachel, his eyes sliding past her as if she were a piece of equipment. Kramer, however, stared directly at her, his gaze heavy with contempt and territorial aggression. The 4 of them walked to the command post, a converted shipping container that had been fitted with air conditioning and office furniture. Inside, the temperature dropped 40 degrees. Colonel Garrett sat behind a field desk, his face the color of a storm about to break. "Master Sergeant," he barked, and Dockery's spine straightened reflexively. "Why is Alpha 12 still redlined? Sergeant Kramer just informed me that your people have it listed as non-mission capable. I want that vehicle green by 1600 hours today." Dockery stood at rigid parade rest, his hands clasped behind his back. "Sir, Alpha 12 has a cracked transfer case. We've welded it 3 times. The housing is fatigue metal. The next time it fails under operational load, it's not going to be a minor mechanical issue. It's going to be catastrophic. We have a new component on order, but it hasn't arrived yet." "I don't care about your excuses, Master Sergeant." Garrett's hand slammed against the desk with enough force to rattle the coffee cup sitting on its surface. "I care about my numbers. We have a major convoy operation scheduled in 48 hours. Every single vehicle in this battalion will be green and ready to roll. Do I make myself clear? Sir, with respect." "Your respect is noted and irrelevant." Garrett cut him off, his voice rising. "Your opinion is not required. Your compliance is. Make it happen." Lieutenant Hammond, sensing his moment, stepped forward with the eagerness of a dog performing for its master. "Sir, we can get it done. The Master Sergeant is being overly cautious. My platoon is ready for anything. We can handle any challenge you put in front of us." Garrett's face transformed, the anger replaced by approval. "That's the attitude I'm talking about, Lieutenant. See Master Sergeant can-do spirit, initiative. Make it happen." Kramer smirked at Dockery, a look of smug satisfaction. His eyes then slid to Rachel, who had remained motionless and silent in the corner of the cramped office. "Yeah, well, observe this, specialist," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "We get the job done no matter what. That's how real soldiers operate." The pressure in the room was suffocating. It was a culture built on fear masked as motivation, ambition dressed as leadership, where bad news was punished and loyalty meant accepting lies. Rachel saw the entire architecture of it, from the cheap projector cable in the briefing tent to the cracked transfer case waiting to fail. A system built on compromises, each one small enough to justify all of them together, adding up to catastrophe. She said nothing. Her job for now was to watch and document, to be invisible until the moment she chose not to be. But her silence seemed to inflame Kramer. He took a step towards her, his body language aggressive, invading her space. "You got something to say, clerk, or are you just here to waste our time with your little checklists?" Before he could continue, Garrett waved a dismissive hand. "Get it done, all of you, out." They filed from the office into the hammer-blow heat of the afternoon. Dockery's shoulders were slumped, the posture of a man carrying a weight he couldn't set down. He knew the order was wrong. To disobey was career suicide. To comply was to gamble with lives. "I have to do it," he said to Rachel, though he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on some distant point beyond the motor pool. "I'll log my protest in writing, but I have to give the order to my men." "You have to follow a lawful order," Rachel corrected quietly. Her voice held no judgment, just precision. "An order that needlessly endangers the lives of soldiers is not a lawful order, Master Sergeant." Dockery stopped walking. He turned to face her fully, and for the first time truly looked at her. Not as a specialist, not as an inspector, but as something he couldn't quite define. "Who the hell are you?" Rachel held his gaze, her eyes steady and calm. "I'm the person who told you that grade 5 bolt was going to shear." She walked away, leaving him standing in the swirling dust, watching her disappear into the maze of vehicles and canvas shelters. Rachel spent the rest of the afternoon in a shadowed corner of the maintenance bay, ostensibly reviewing technical manuals on her tablet. In reality, she was watching. The mechanics moved with the frantic energy of men under pressure, their movements quick and nervous. She saw them pull Alpha 12 into the service area, saw the young specialist with grease-stained hands position his welding equipment. The weld he laid over the fractured transfer case was thick and ugly, a desperate patch on metal that had already given everything it had to give. The specialist's hands trembled slightly as he worked, and Rachel could see the knowledge in his eyes. He knew this wouldn't hold, but he also knew what happened to soldiers who told colonels they were wrong. Sergeant First Class Kramer hovered over the work like a vulture, his presence a constant source of stress. He barked encouragement that sounded like threats, his voice echoing through the bay. "Faster, we don't have all day. The colonel wants this done, so it gets done. You hear me, Callahan? Private Callahan. The young welder nodded without looking up. His face was pale beneath the grime, his jaw clenched tight. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the sky changed. The usual pale blue bled into something sickly and wrong, a bruised yellow that spoke of violence approaching. Rachel felt it before she saw it, a change in air pressure, a shift in the quality of the wind. The base's warning sirens began to wail, a piercing shriek that cut through every conversation and stopped every task. The loudspeakers crackled to life, a voice tight with urgency breaking through the static. All call signs, all call signs. Stand to. I repeat, stand to. STARS reports enemy vehicle movement 20 kilometers east of Sector Gamma. All units prepare for possible contact. This is not a drill. The motor pool transformed instantly. The languid afternoon rhythm shattered into controlled chaos. Soldiers ran to their vehicles. Engines started with roaring coughs of diesel. Officers shouted orders. The machinery of military response grinding into motion. Colonel Garrett's voice boomed across the base radio net, broadcast through speakers mounted on every building. All platoon leaders form your elements. Full combat load. We roll in 30 minutes. Show them what 98% readiness looks like. Rachel moved to the edge of the hard stand, watching the organized chaos unfold. She wasn't running, she wasn't shouting. She stood perfectly still, her eyes tracking the movement of vehicles and personnel with the same clinical attention she had given to the bolts and gaskets. She saw Lieutenant Hammond climb into the commander's hatch of Alpha 12, his face flushed with excitement and fear in equal measure. His first real test. His chance to prove himself. He gave a thumbs up to someone below his gesture full of bravado. Rachel pulled her tablet from her cargo pocket and began typing, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. She was documenting timestamps, vehicle assignments, personnel positions, building a record that would be unassailable. Dockery found her there, his face grim. You need to stop this, he said, his voice low and urgent. You have power, I don't. You're IG, aren't you? You have to be. Nobody else knows vehicles like this. Rachel didn't confirm or deny. She just looked at him, her expression neutral. Not yet, Master Sergeant. Evidence needs to be ironclad. Accusations without proof are just noise. Evidence? Dockery's voice cracked slightly. My grandson is on that vehicle. Private Tyler Dockery. Gunner position. That transfer case is going to fail and you know it. For the first time, emotion flickered across Rachel's face. Brief, controlled, but real. I know, she said quietly, but if I reveal myself now, before the failure, Garrett will bury me in paperwork and regulations. The system will protect him. I need the truth to be undeniable. Dockery stared at her, and in his eyes she saw accusation and understanding warring with each other. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips. What could he say? She was right. The system was designed to protect rank, not truth. The convoy began to form on the main road that led to the entry control point. 12 vehicles, their engines running, soldiers moving in and out of hatches, performing final checks. The haboob was visible now on the eastern horizon, a wall of yellow-brown cloud rising thousands of feet into the air, advancing like something alive and malevolent. Rachel saw Garrett emerge from the command post, his uniform still parade ground perfect despite the rising wind. He walked toward the forming convoy with the stride of a man convinced of his own invincibility. She intercepted him before he reached the lead vehicle, stepping into his path with deliberate purpose. Sir, I need 2 minutes of your time. Garrett's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. I don't have 2 minutes, specialist. We have a tactical situation developing. Alpha 12 will fail, Rachel said, her voice cutting through the engine noise with quiet intensity. The transfer case is compromised. I have technical data showing. Before she could finish, Kramer materialized at Garrett's shoulder, his bulk blocking Rachel's line of sight to the colonel. You don't talk to the colonel during tactical operations, clerk, he said, his voice a low growl. Step back and let the real soldiers handle this. Rachel didn't move. Sergeant, I'm trying to prevent... Know your place, bitch. The word hung in the air between them for a fraction of a second. Then Kramer's hand moved fast and hard, the slap connecting with Rachel's cheek with an audible crack that carried across the staging area. The world seemed to stop. 500 soldiers scattered across the motor pool and staging area froze in mid-action. Conversations died. Movement ceased. Every eye turned toward the sound. Rachel's head had snapped to the side from the impact. A red mark bloomed across her cheek. For one long moment, she stood perfectly still, her face turned away, her body absorbing the shock. Then slowly, deliberately, she straightened. Her head turned back to face Kramer, her movements controlled and precise. When her eyes met his, they were utterly calm. No anger, no fear, just cold mathematical certainty. "That was a mistake, Sergeant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kramer's face twisted into a sneer. He raised his hand again, emboldened by her apparent passivity. "I'll teach you to—" He never finished the sentence. Rachel's left hand moved with the speed of long training, intercepting Kramer's wrist mid-swing. Her fingers found the radial nerve with surgical precision, driving into the pressure point, with enough force to send a jolt of electric pain up his arm. His hand went instantly numb, his fingers splaying uselessly. Before Kramer's brain could process what was happening, Rachel pivoted. Her body rotated inside his reach, her right shoulder pressing against his chest, her center of gravity dropping. Her right hand seized his other wrist, the one he was bringing up reflexively to grab her. She didn't use strength against strength. She used physics, leverage, the precise application of force against anatomical weak points that had been mapped and studied for centuries of martial combat. Her left hand maintained control of his numb right wrist, pulling it down and across her body. Her right hand pushed his left wrist up and back, rotating it past the point where the joint was designed to move. She applied the standing wrist lock with the calm efficiency of someone adjusting a piece of machinery, her movements economical and exact. There were two distinct sounds. Sharp cracks like green wood breaking audible even over the idling engines and rising wind. Both of Kramer's wrists dislocated simultaneously, the small bones of the carpals forced out of alignment ligaments, tearing nerves screaming. His scream was high and thin, a sound of pure shock and agony. His knees buckled, his body folding forward as his brain tried to process the cascade of pain, signals flooding in from both arms. He collapsed to the concrete, cradling his ruined hands against his chest, his face a mask of disbelief and suffering. The entire sequence had taken 8 seconds from the initial slap to Kramer's collapse. Rachel stepped back, her breathing unchanged, her expression as calm as if she had just completed a routine equipment check. She looked down at Kramer with the detached assessment of an engineer examining a malfunctioning component. Then she raised her voice, projecting across the silent staging area where 500 soldiers stood frozen in shock. "Sergeant Kramer just committed assault on a federal investigator. Medics, please see to him." She turned to Colonel Garrett, whose face had gone the color of old paper. "Colonel, that convoy doesn't roll." Garrett's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then his brain caught up with events and rage flooded back into his features. You assaulted an NCO MP's arrest this soldier." Two military police sergeants, who had been watching from near the command post, started forward uncertainly. They had witnessed everything. They had seen Kramer strike first, but they also understood the chain of command. Master Sergeant Dockery stepped between Rachel and the advancing MPs. His body language suddenly transformed from defeated to immovable. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying across the staging area with surprising force, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." He leaned close to Garrett, whispering urgently, his words meant only for the colonel's ears. Rachel watched Garrett's face change as Dockery spoke, saw the color drain away, again saw understanding, and then something that might have been fear flicker across his features. Garrett's hand came up, stopping the MPs in their tracks. When he spoke, his voice had lost its commanding certainty. "Convoy launches in 30 minutes. All units mount up." Dockery straightened, his whisper apparently complete. "Sir, I strongly recommend delaying until—" "I gave you an order, Master Sergeant." Garrett's voice was raw now, stripped of its earlier confidence. This was no longer about readiness or tactical necessity. This was about pride, about a colonel who had been embarrassed in front of his entire command and couldn't afford to back down. "Yes, sir," Dockery said, the words bitter in his mouth. Rachel watched as the machinery of military hierarchy reasserted itself. Medics rushed to Kramer, who was still keening in pain, his wrists already swelling to grotesque proportions. Soldiers climbed back into vehicles, their movements subdued, now uncertain. The haboob loomed closer, its leading edge now visible as a towering wall of churning dust and sand that blotted out the horizon. The light had taken on a strange apocalyptic quality, the sun filtering through the approaching storm as a sickly orange disk. Rachel pulled her tablet from her pocket and began to type, her fingers steady. She was transmitting data to a secure server in Washington, D.C., building a record that would survive whatever came next. Timestamps. Witness statements recorded on video, technical specifications, the complete chain of events that had led to this moment. Lieutenant Hammond appeared in the commander's hatch of Alpha 12, his earlier excitement now tempered by visible nervousness. He looked at Rachel as the vehicle's engine roared to life, and she could see the question in his eyes. The doubt. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. There was nothing more she could do. Not yet. The convoy began to roll 12 vehicles moving toward the entry control point, in a column, their armor plates catching the strange orange light. Inside Alpha 12, she knew a cracked transfer case held together by desperate welds was beginning to heat up the metal, expanding, the stress points growing with every revolution of the drive shaft. Rachel checked her watch. Based on the thermal stress calculations and the estimated speed of the convoy, she had approximately 17 minutes before physics overrode desperation. Master Sergeant Dockery stood beside her, watching his grandson's vehicle disappear into the gathering storm. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw working silently. 17 minutes, Rachel said quietly, echoing her own thoughts. Maybe less if they push hard. Dockery turned to look at her, and she saw the question he was afraid to ask. We prepare for triage, she said, her voice steady and professional, and we get ready to save as many as we can when it all comes apart. The wind began to pick up, carrying the first stinging grains of sand from the approaching haboob. The sky darkened. The storm was almost upon them. And somewhere out there beyond the fence line, a transfer case was counting down to failure with the inexorable certainty of a ticking clock. The haboob's leading edge struck forward operating base Viper like the hand of an angry god. The wall of sand and wind arrived with a roar that drowned out the idling engines and shouted orders, turning the world into a churning chaos of brown and yellow. Visibility collapsed from miles to meters in seconds. The sky disappeared behind a curtain of dust so thick it turned afternoon into twilight. Rachel stood at the edge of the motor pool, her body leaning slightly into the wind, her eyes narrowed against the stinging particles that found every gap in her uniform. She had pulled her shemagh up over her nose and mouth, the fabric doing little to filter the fine powder that seemed to penetrate everything. Around her, soldiers scrambled for cover, running toward buildings and vehicles with their arms shielding their faces. She didn't move. Her tablet was tucked inside her cargo pocket, protected from the elements. Her hands hung loose at her sides. She was waiting, counting. The convoy had rolled out 14 minutes ago. The vehicles had disappeared into the storm, almost immediately swallowed by the advancing wall of sand. Radio chatter had been steady at first, the usual traffic of the tactical movement, call signs checking in, distance markers being reported, the professional calm of soldiers executing a familiar task. Then at minute 17, the quality of the radio traffic changed. A high-pitched metallic shriek cut through the static, a sound like a circular saw biting into steel. It lasted 3 seconds, building in intensity, before it was drowned out by a sound Rachel knew too well. The percussive bang of metal failing catastrophically under stress, followed by the grinding roar of a multi-ton vehicle coming apart. The radio net exploded into chaos. "Contact IED at the ECP," someone screamed, their voice cracking with panic. "Negative, negative," another voice cut in. "That was not an IED. Alpha 12 is down. Repeat, Alpha 12 is down. Alpha 12 is on fire. Jesus Christ, it's burning. I've got casualties, multiple casualties. We need medics now. The gate is blocked. The entire ECP is blocked. We can't get through." Through the howling wind and static, Rachel could hear Lieutenant Hammond's voice, younger now, stripped of its earlier bravado. "We're trapped in the vehicle. The hatches are jammed. Fire spreading. I can smell smoke. Oh God, I can smell smoke." In the command post visible through the blast-proof windows, even through the sandstorm, Rachel could see figures moving in agitation. Officers clustered around radio sets and computer screens. Colonel Garrett was pacing, his shadow thrown large against the wall by the emergency lighting. His voice boomed over the base-wide speaker system, audible even through the storm. "What's happening? Somebody give me a sit rep. Get the fires out. Clear that gate. Move, move, move. The orders were a stream of panicked noise devoid of structure or priority. Garrett was shouting into the storm, throwing commands like a man trying to bail out a sinking ship with his bare hands. No clear direction, no coherent plan, just noise and fury. Rachel pulled her tablet from her pocket, shielding the screen with her body. Her fingers moved across the interface, accessing the base vehicle tracking system through a back door she had discovered during her initial survey. The security on FOB Viper's network was adequate for keeping out external threats, but laughable for someone with her level of access and training. The tracking display showed the convoy's position. 12 green icons, 11 of them clustered near the entry control point in a tangled mass. The 12th icon, Alpha 12, was stationary and flashing red. Around it, the other icons were barely moving their GPS signatures, showing the chaotic stop and start of vehicles trying to maneuver in zero visibility. But there was something else, something that made Rachel's jaw tighten. The communication logs showed that Alpha 12's long-range radio system had failed 6 minutes before the transfer case. Not battle damage, not storm interference. A clean system shutdown, the kind that happened when someone with technical knowledge disabled specific components. She pulled up the maintenance access logs, her fingers flying across the screen. There. Sergeant First Class Dale Kramer had accessed Alpha 12's communication bay at 0530 that morning, 4 hours before the convoy brief. He had logged it as a routine inspection, but the timestamp showed he had been in the bay for 47 minutes, far too long for a simple inspection. Rachel's mind assembled the picture with cold precision. Kramer had sabotaged the vehicle's ability to call for help, ensuring that when it failed, the crew would be isolated, unable to communicate clearly with the base. The disaster would happen far enough from the phobie that it could be blamed on enemy action or the storm. Not equipment failure, not command negligence, just the fog of war. This wasn't just incompetence. This was premeditated. She closed the tablet and looked toward the command post. Through the blast windows, she could see Garrett still pacing, still shouting. Officers and NCOs milled around him, but no one was taking decisive action. The system had paralyzed itself, waiting for the colonel to provide direction, and the colonel was providing nothing but panic. Master Sergeant Dockery appeared at her side, materializing from the storm like a ghost. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with barely controlled terror. "My grandson is on that vehicle," he said, his voice hoarse. "Tyler, he's the gunner. He's 23 years old. This is his second deployment. His mother, my daughter, she made me promise I'd look out for him." Rachel looked at him, and for the first time since arriving at FOB Viper, her professional mask slipped slightly. "I know," she said quietly. "I pulled the crew manifest. I'm sorry." "Sorry," Dockery's voice cracked. "You knew this would happen. You told us. You stood right there and told Garrett this exact thing would happen, and he did it anyway. And now my grandson is burning alive out there, while that bastard stands in his air-conditioned office shouting orders that don't mean anything." "Master Sergeant," Rachel's voice was calm, but it carried an edge of command that cut through his rising hysteria. "I need you to focus. Your grandson is still alive. Hammond reported smoke inhalation, not burns. That means the fire hasn't reached the crew compartment yet. We have a window, minutes, not hours, but we have a window." Dockery stared at her, his breathing ragged. "What do we do?" "You stay here," Rachel said. "When I give the word, I need you to back me up. Endorse my orders to the maintenance crews. Can you do that?" "Who are you?" Dockery asked again, but this time the question was different. Not suspicious. Pleading. Desperate for her to be what he needed her to be. Rachel didn't answer. She was already moving and walking toward the fire suppression station with long, deliberate strides that seemed to bend the chaos around her. The wind tore at her uniform, the sand peppering her exposed skin, but she moved as if the storm didn't exist. She grabbed 2 large fire extinguishers from their mounts, industrial-grade units, filled with chemical foam designed for petroleum fires. She shoved one into the hands of a private who was standing frozen near the motor pool entrance, his eyes wide with shock. "With me," she said, her voice cutting through his paralysis. "Aim for the base of the fire. Short, controlled bursts. Stay low." The private nodded mutely, his body responding to the command, even as his brain struggled to process the situation. Rachel moved toward the entry control point, visible now as a hellscape of orange flame and churning smoke backlit by the sandstorm. The fire had spread from Alpha 12 to the surrounding area, fed by hydraulic fluid and diesel fuel. The vehicle behind it, Alpha 9, had crashed into the burning hulk, its front end crumpled steam rising from a ruptured radiator. Sergeant First Class Kramer, his wrists bandaged and splinted, was standing near a cluster of soldiers trying to organize them into some kind of response. His face was pale with pain, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He was shouting, adding to the confusion, his voice high and strained. He saw Rachel moving with purpose, saw her directing the young private, saw her assuming authority without permission or rank. His face twisted with rage, the anger of a man whose world had been turned upside down and who had found a target for his humiliation. He stomped toward her, his splinted hands held awkwardly against his chest. "Who the hell do you think you are? Specialist!" he screamed over the wind. "Get back to the rear. Let the real soldiers handle this." He reached out with his bandaged hand, trying to shove her back toward the buildings, trying to reassert the dominance that had defined his entire career. Rachel stopped walking. She turned to face him fully, and the expression on her face was something beyond cold. It was absolute zero, the look of someone who had reached the end of patience and found only purpose beyond it. "Sergeant Kramer," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie but not shouting, "you sabotaged Alpha 12's communication system at 0530 this morning. You spent 47 minutes in the comm bay disabling the long-range radio and the backup transmitter. You wanted this disaster to happen far enough from the base that it could be written off as enemy contact or equipment failure beyond anyone's control. You engineered this." Kramer's face went from red to white in an instant. Around them, soldiers stopped moving, their attention caught by the accusation. Even through the howling wind, Rachel's words carried with crystal clarity. "You're insane," Kramer stammered. "You're a goddamn clerk who just assaulted me, and now you're making up conspiracy theories while soldiers are dying. The maintenance logs are time-stamped," Rachel continued, her voice relentless. "I have access to the complete digital record. I also have video footage from the security camera covering the motorpool maintenance bay. Would you like me to submit that to CID right now? Or would you prefer to step aside and let me save the soldiers you have endangered?" Kramer's mouth worked silently. His eyes darted around, looking for support, for someone to back him up. But the soldiers watching had seen him slap a specialist. They had seen her break both his wrists in 8 seconds. And now she was accusing him of sabotage while a vehicle burned with men trapped inside. No one moved to help him. Rachel turned her back on him, dismissing him as irrelevant, and continued toward the flames. The private with the fire extinguisher followed, and then another soldier joined them, and another. Within 30 seconds, a team had formed around her, moving with purpose, while the official command structure remained paralyzed. She keyed the handset on a nearby vehicle's radio, commandeering the base-wide command net. When her voice came through the speakers mounted across Faux-Bouilly Viper, it was the antithesis of everything that had ruled the airways for the past 10 minutes. No panic, no uncertainty, just calm, absolute authority. "All call signs on this net. This is Viper Actual. Cease all transmissions. Stand by for instructions." The designation Viper Actual was reserved for the base commander. For a specialist to use it was beyond unthinkable. It was a violation of every regulation in the book. But the sheer confidence in her voice, the unshakable certainty, commanded obedience. The radio net went silent. "Fire team," Rachel continued, her voice measured and precise. "You have 2 burning vehicles at the ECP. Priority 1 is Alpha 12. Focus suppression on the engine compartment to prevent fuel cells explosion. Use foam, not water. Approach from upwind." She paused, listening to the wind, calculating angles and distances with the precision of an artillery computer. "Rescue Team, Lieutenant Hammond reports his crew is trapped. The side hatches are jammed from the impact. Do not waste time on them. The rear ramp is your entry point. It has a manual release that can be accessed from outside. Get a Halligan bar and a spreader. Pry the ramp. Move now." Another pause. "Wrecker 1, you are our primary recovery asset. Do not approach the burning vehicles. That is not your job. Your job is to clear the 3rd vehicle, Alpha 6, the one bogged down in the sand off the hardball. Use your main winch. Pull it backwards, clear a path through the ECP. Once we have a lane open, emergency vehicles can access the site." Her orders were a masterclass in crisis management. Each one was specific, achievable, and prioritized. She wasn't trying to solve everything at once. She was breaking a complex disaster into a series of simple tasks, creating a logical sequence that soldiers could follow even through fear and confusion. Medics establish a casualty collection point at the motorpool command post. It's upwind from the smoke and has hard cover. Wait for my signal before moving forward. When casualties start coming, I need you ready to receive them, not standing in the middle of the chaos. Master Sergeant Dockery, listening on his handheld radio, felt something shift in his chest. He recognized what he was hearing. Not just competence, leadership. The kind of leadership that came from someone who had been tested by fire and emerged knowing exactly what they were capable of. He keyed his own mic, his voice steadying as he spoke. All maintenance personnel, you heard Viper, actual. Get that wrecker moving now. Full power. I want Alpha 6 clear in 5 minutes. His endorsement was the final piece. Dockery was the senior NCO, the man these soldiers had followed for years. If he was obeying the specialist orders, then those orders were legitimate. The maintenance crew surged into motion, their earlier paralysis breaking like a dam. The effect rippled across the base. Fire teams equipped with foam extinguishers advanced on the blaze in coordinated pairs. A rescue team armed with hydraulic tools sprinted toward Alpha 12's rear ramp. The massive M88 recovery vehicle roared to life, its diesel engine bellowing as it positioned itself to winch the bog striker free. Rachel stood in the center of the organized chaos, a still point in the turning world. She held the radio handset in one hand, her eyes scanning the scene, processing information, adjusting plans in real time. She coordinated the teams with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, her voice never rising, never betraying stress. The fire suppression team reached Alpha 12 and began laying down foam, the white chemical blanket, smothering the flames at the engine compartment. The heat was intense enough to be felt 50 meters away, but the soldiers worked with focused determination, their movements guided by Rachel's calm instructions. The rescue team reached the rear ramp. A sergeant with 20 years of experience examined the twisted metal where the impact had jammed the hydraulic mechanism. He positioned the Halligan bar, a heavy prying tool designed for forced entry, and began to lever the ramp open. The metal groaned in protest. Steady pressure. Rachel's voice came through his radio. Don't rush it. The hydraulics are compromised. If you force it too fast, you'll collapse the frame and crush anyone inside. The sergeant adjusted his technique, his movements becoming more measured. Slowly, with agonizing care, the ramp began to move. 1 centimeter, 2, 5. Inside the command post, Colonel Garrett emerged into the storm, his face a mask of confusion and rage. He saw his base operating under someone else's orders, saw his soldiers following commands that hadn't come from him. He saw Rachel standing near the burning vehicle, speaking calmly into a radio handset, and his brain finally made the connection. He stormed toward her, his boots splashing through puddles of foam and water, his uniform already soaked and sandblasted. "You," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "Who in the goddamn hell do you think you are, impersonating a commander, issuing illegal orders on my net? I'll have you court-martialed. You are finished." Rachel turned to face him slowly. She lowered the radio handset but didn't release it. She didn't flinch from his tirade. She simply watched him, her expression utterly calm, waiting for him to run out of steam. But before Garrett could continue, another figure emerged from the storm. Command Sergeant Major Frank Reynolds was 58 years old with a face that looked like it had been carved from desert stone. He had served in 3 wars and had forgotten more about leadership than most officers would ever learn. He had been in the Tactical Operations Center when Rachel's voice came over the net, and he had known immediately what was happening. Reynolds moved with the deliberate speed of a man on a mission. He scanned the scene, his eyes taking in the organized response, the soldiers working in coordinated teams, the fire being suppressed, the rescue operation proceeding with professional precision. Then his eyes found Rachel, and his entire body went rigid. He had seen her photograph in a classified briefing 6 months ago. A warning sent to all command sergeant majors about a particular warrant officer who was conducting sensitive investigations. The photograph had been accompanied by a simple instruction. If she appears at your installation, cooperate fully and contact the IG immediately. Reynolds stopped 3 paces from Rachel and came to attention with a precision that would have made a drill sergeant weep. Ma'am, he said, his voice cutting through the wind with parade ground clarity. My apologies. I was not aware you were on this fob. The word ma'am hung in the air like a thunderclap. Garrett's mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and the first cold touch of fear. Sergeant Major, what is the meaning of this? Have you lost your mind? This is Specialist Brennan from Divisional Logistics. Reynolds didn't look at the colonel. His eyes remained fixed on Rachel with the kind of respect a soldier shows to a superior officer. Sir, I strongly recommend you stand down. Right now. Rachel reached into the breast pocket of her uniform, her movements unhurried. She pulled out a laminated identification card, holding it up so the emergency strobes from a nearby ambulance flashed across its surface. The card spun slowly, catching the light. Garrett squinted his eyes, tracing the lettering. He saw the name Brennan Rachel S. He saw the photograph. And then he saw the rank insignia printed beside her name. Not the single chevron of a specialist, just 3 silver bars arranged in a rectangle bisected by black enamel squares. The insignia of a chief warrant officer. 3. Beneath her name, printed in stark black letters, was her title, Technical Inspector, Office of the Inspector General, U.S. Army Materiel Command. The blood drained from Colonel Garrett's face so quickly he swayed on his feet. His eyes went wide, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. An Inspector General warrant officer. Not some low-level auditor from division. Not a clerk checking boxes. But a high-level federal investigator operating under direct authority from the Pentagon. IG warrants were legendary, ghosts in the system. They moved quietly, observed everything, and their reports could end careers with surgical precision. They were the ones sent when the numbers didn't add up, when commanders were suspected of fraud, when soldiers were dying because leaders were lying. Garrett took a stumbling step backward. The loud commanding authority he had wielded just hours ago evaporated into the sand-filled wind like smoke. He was no longer a colonel berating a subordinate. He was a field-grade officer standing before a direct representative of the highest echelons of his service. And he had just been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, his lies made manifest in burning metal and trapped soldiers. I don't understand. He stammered, his voice a pathetic whisper compared to his earlier volume. You understood the order to falsify maintenance records. Rachel said, her voice quiet but carrying immense weight. You understood the order to deploy vehicles with known critical deficiencies. You understood the order to prioritize readiness statistics over the lives of your soldiers. My understanding is not the issue here, Colonel. Behind them there was a grinding shriek of metal. The rescue team had forced the rear ramp of Alpha 12 open far enough to create a gap. Soldiers in fire-resistant gear plunged into the smoke-filled interior, their headlamps cutting through the darkness. 30 seconds later, they emerged carrying 2 figures. Lieutenant Hammond was conscious but coughing violently, his face blackened with soot. The second figure was Private Tyler Dockery, Dockery's grandson, unconscious from smoke inhalation, but breathing. Master Sergeant Dockery broke from his position near the motor pool and ran toward the rescue team, his age and dignity forgotten. He reached his grandson as the medics were loading him onto a stretcher, his hands hovering over the young man's body, afraid to touch, afraid to hurt him further. He's alive, Master Sergeant, one of the medics said. Smoke inhalation, possible concussion. But he's breathing on his own. He's going to make it. Dockery's knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the stretcher, his shoulders shaking with sobs he couldn't control. 32 years of military bearing collapsed in the face of a grandfather's relief. Rachel watched from a distance, her expression softening, almost imperceptibly. Then she turned back to Garrett, and the softness vanished. Colonel, you are relieved of command, effective immediately. Sergeant Major Reynolds will assume temporary command of this FO pending the arrival of an investigating officer from Army Materiel Command. You will confine yourself to your quarters and await further instructions. Do you understand? Garrett's mouth worked silently. His entire world had collapsed in the span of 10 minutes. His career, his reputation, his future, all of it gone, burned away as surely as the vehicle still smoldering at the ECP. Do you understand, Colonel? Rachel repeated, her voice hardening. Yes, Garrett whispered. Then from somewhere deep in his training, muscle memory forced the words out. Yes, ma'am. Reynolds gestured and 2 military police sergeants approached. They didn't touch. Garrett didn't restrain him. They simply flanked him, their presence making it clear that he was no longer in command. He walked between them toward the command post, his shoulders slumped, a broken man. The storm was beginning to ease. The Haboob's leading edge had passed through, leaving behind a world covered in fine dust and scattered debris. The fires were under control, now reduced to smoldering patches being doused with foam. The wrecker had pulled Alpha 6 free, clearing a path through the ECP. Emergency vehicles were rolling in, medics moving among the casualties with practiced efficiency. Rachel stood in the center of it all, her uniform filthy, her face streaked with sweat and sand. She looked at the scene with the detached assessment of a surgeon examining their work. The disaster had been managed. Lives had been saved. The evidence was now irrefutable. She pulled her tablet from her pocket and began typing, her fingers moving across the screen with mechanical precision. She was documenting everything. Every order given, every action taken, every second of the response, building a record that would withstand any legal challenge, any attempt to spin the narrative. Sergeant First Class Kramer stood at the edge of the scene, forgotten in the chaos. His bandaged hands hung uselessly at his sides. His face was the color of old paper. He had watched his entire world unravel, had seen the specialist he had slapped reveal herself as a federal investigator, had heard his sabotage exposed in front of witnesses. He knew what was coming. The investigation, the charges, the court-martial. His career was over, but more than that, his identity was shattered. He had built himself into Garrett's enforcer, had defined himself by his willingness to do what needed to be done, to be the hard man who made difficult calls. And he had been wrong, catastrophically, irredeemably wrong. Rachel's eyes found him across the motor pool. She walked toward him with the same deliberate pace, and he saw his own destruction reflected in her calm gaze. "Sergeant Kramer," she said when she reached him, "you sabotaged military equipment during wartime operations, resulting in injuries to American soldiers. That's Article 108, destruction of government property. Article 134, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. And depending on how the investigation proceeds, possibly Article 128, assault with intent to commit murder." Kramer's legs gave out. He sat heavily on a concrete barrier, his face in his bandaged hands. "I thought Garrett said we had to maintain readiness. He said it was for the mission, for the Army." "Garrett lied," Rachel said simply, "and you chose to believe him because it was easier than standing up to him, easier than doing what you knew was right, easier than protecting the soldiers you were supposed to lead." "I'm sorry," Kramer whispered, the words barely audible. "God, I'm so sorry." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked away, leaving him sitting alone in the settling dust. Rachel paused at the tent entrance and turned back. "Sergeant Kramer, one more question. Why did Garrett push so hard? What was division holding over him?" Kramer's head lifted slightly, his eyes hollow. "Colonel Webb called him 6 months ago. Said Garrett was on the short list for brigade commander, but his last OER had questions about his judgment. Webb told him the only way to fix it was to show perfect readiness metrics. No excuses, no failures." He coughed, wincing. Garrett panicked. He thought if he didn't make the numbers, division would relieve him for cause. End of career, no star, no brigade. So he started editing logs. And when that wasn't enough, he started threatening people. Webb knew what was happening. He had to, but he kept pushing anyway. Rachel's jaw tightened. Did Garrett ever push back, ever tell Webb it was impossible? "Once," Kramer said. "I was there. Garrett said the supply chain couldn't support the readiness targets. Webb said, 'That sounds like a you problem, Frank. Fix it or find a new job.' After that, Garrett became..." He trailed off. "He became what he thought he had to be." Rachel nodded slowly. "Thank you, Sergeant. That helps." As she walked away, she pulled out her tablet and added Kramer's statement to the evidence file. Garrett wasn't just ambitious. He was desperate, trapped between impossible demands and career survival. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained the systemic rot that created him. And it meant Colonel Marcus Webb was going down too. The sun was beginning to set, turning the post-storm sky into a canvas of orange and purple. The base was slowly returning to normal operations. The crisis managed, the immediate danger past. But the real work, Rachel knew, was just beginning. She had the evidence now. Irrefutable. Undeniable. documented with timestamps and witness statements and video footage. Colonel Garrett had deployed vehicles he knew were unsafe. Sergeant Kramer had sabotaged equipment. Lives had been endangered through negligence and pride. And somewhere in the chain of command above Garrett, someone had created the pressure that led to this moment. Someone had demanded readiness numbers that couldn't be achieved honestly. Someone had built a system where lying was rewarded and truth was punished. Rachel pulled out her satellite phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. The call connected after 2 rings. Inspector General's office. How may I direct your call? This is CW3 Brennan badge number 7742. I need to speak with Colonel Hayes in IG Operations. Priority Alpha. One moment, ma'am. The line clicked and then a male voice came through, clipped and professional. Hayes? Sir, this is Brennan. FO Viper investigation. I'm requesting a full IG team and a CID detachment. We have charges ranging from equipment fraud to sabotage to assault on a federal officer. I need forensic accountants, technical investigators, and legal support. There was a pause on the other end. Jesus, Rachel, what did you find? Everything, sir. The whole rotten structure. And it goes higher than the installation commander. I need authorization to expand the investigation to division level. Another pause longer this time. You have it. I'll have a team wheels up within 2 hours. And Rachel, be careful. Division commanders don't go down quietly. Understood, sir. She ended the call and looked out across FO Viper. Soldiers were moving in the gathering darkness, their silhouettes backlit by work lights and the last rays of the setting sun. They had no idea how close they had come to catastrophe, how many of them might have died if the transfer case had failed on a different vehicle or at a different time or in a situation where Rachel Brennan hadn't been there to manage the response. Master Sergeant Dockery approached, his eyes red, but his bearing restored. Chief, he said, using her proper rank for the first time, my grandson wants to meet you. He's conscious now. The medics say he'll make a full recovery. Rachel nodded. I'd be honored, Master Sergeant. They walked together toward the medical tent, 2 soldiers who had started the day as strangers and ended it as something closer to allies. Behind them, FOB Viper continued its work, unaware that in the coming days, everything would change. The reckoning had only just begun. The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and canvas, the sharp chemical tang cutting through the residual dust that permeated everything on FOB Viper. Emergency lights cast harsh shadows across rows of cots, where soldiers lay in various states of injury and recovery. The sounds were muted now, the earlier chaos replaced by the quiet efficiency of medical professionals working through their triage. Private Tyler Dockery occupied a cot near the center of the tent, an oxygen mask pressed to his face, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. His uniform was cut away, revealing smoke-stained skin and the beginnings of bruises across his ribs where he had been thrown against the interior of Alpha 12 during the impact. But he was conscious, his eyes tracking movement around the tent with the alertness of someone who had just brushed against death and come away grateful. Master Sergeant William Dockery sat beside his grandson's cot, his weathered hand gripping the young man's forearm with a gentleness that contradicted his bulk. When Rachel and Dockery approached, Tyler's eyes shifted to them, widening slightly as he recognized the woman who had commanded the rescue operation. Grandfather says you saved us, Tyler said, his voice hoarse and rasping from smoke inhalation. He pulled the oxygen mask aside despite a medic's warning gesture. Says you knew the vehicle would fail, that you tried to stop it. Rachel pulled up a metal folding chair and sat, bringing herself to eye level with the injured private. Your grandfather's maintenance logs saved you, Private. He documented every failure, every denied requisition, every warning he gave. When this goes to investigation, his testimony will be what hangs the people responsible. Tyler's eyes moved to his grandfather, seeing the old NCO in a new light. Dockery Sr. looked away, uncomfortable with the praise, his jaw working silently. Lieutenant Hammond is asking for you, Chief, a medic called from across the tent. Says it's important. Rachel stood and moved to where Hammond lay on a cot 3 positions down. The young officer's face was clean now, the soot washed away to reveal the pale, shocked features of a man who had just learned what his ambition had nearly cost. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from smoke or tears Rachel couldn't determine. Ma'am, Hammond said, struggling to sit up. Rachel gestured for him to remain still. I need to tell you everything about Garrett, about the pressure he put on us, about how we knew. God help me, we knew the vehicles weren't ready, and we said they were anyway. You'll have the opportunity to give a formal statement, Rachel said, her voice neutral. CID investigators are en route. They'll take your testimony under oath. Hammond's hands clenched the thin blanket covering him. I wanted the OER bullet points, a successful convoy operation under combat conditions. It would have looked good for my evaluation for my career. I told myself it was just risk management, that all military operations carry risk. But it wasn't risk. It was certainty. You told us it would fail, and I smiled and nodded and climbed into that vehicle anyway. Lieutenant, Rachel's voice softened slightly. You survived. Your soldiers survived. That gives you something most officers never get. A second chance. The question is what you do with it. She reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out a small object. A challenge coin worn smooth from years of handling. On one side was the crest of the 82nd Airborne. On the other, engraved in simple letters, was a name, Morrison David R. This belonged to my best friend, Rachel said, placing the coin in Hammond's hand. He died 15 years ago because his commanding officer ignored the same warnings I gave you today. Same equipment failures. Same bureaucratic pressure to maintain false readiness numbers. Same choice between career advancement and soldiers' lives. Hammond stared at the coin, his fingers closing around it. What happened to the officer? Nothing, Rachel said flatly. The investigation was buried. He made general 2 years later. That's why I do what I do, Lieutenant. Someone has to care more about the truth than about protecting the system. She stood to leave, but Hammond's voice stopped her. Chief, my uncle is Senator Thomas Porter, Armed Services Committee. When I called him from the hospital, when I told him what happened here, he said he's launching a congressional inquiry. This is going to go beyond just FO Viper. Rachel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Interest. Calculation. What exactly did you tell your uncle, Lieutenant? Everything. The falsified maintenance logs. The pressure from division. Garrett's threats against Master Sergeant Dockery. Kramer's sabotage. All of it. Uncle Thomas said if this is happening here, it's probably happening at other installations. He wants to know how deep it goes. Rachel nodded slowly. That's good, Lieutenant. That's using your privilege for something that matters. Hold on to that coin. When you're tempted to take shortcuts again, when some colonel offers you a good OER in exchange for your integrity, remember what it costs to get it back. The tent flap opened, admitting Command Sergeant Major Reynolds and 2 Criminal Investigation Division agents in civilian clothes. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s with the hard eyes of someone who had seen every variation of military corruption and lost the capacity for surprise. Chief Warrant Officer Brennan, the woman said, extending her hand. Special Agent Patricia Thornton, CID. We need to debrief you and secure the evidence. Rachel shook her hand. My tablet has the complete digital record. Video, audio maintenance logs, communication intercepts. I've also compiled witness statements and technical analysis. Everything is encrypted and backed up to the IG server in DC. Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly. You came prepared. I always do, Agent Thornton. This is my 90th investigation. I've learned to document everything in real time. They moved to a quiet corner of the tent where a folding table had been set up. Rachel placed her tablet on the surface and began walking Thornton through the evidence, her presentation methodical and comprehensive. The falsified readiness reports cross-referenced with actual maintenance records. The pattern of denied parts requisitions. The email trail showing pressure from division. Kramer's access logs showing his sabotage of Alpha 12's communications. This is airtight, Thornton said after 30 minutes of review. Garrett's finished. Kramer's looking at 5 to 10 years in Leavenworth. But you mentioned division involvement. How high does this go? Rachel pulled up another file on her tablet. Colonel Garrett received 17 emails over the past 6 months from Division G4, the logistics officer. Each one referenced readiness targets that were mathematically impossible to achieve with the current supply chain. The final email sent 3 weeks ago explicitly stated that failure to meet 95% readiness would result in relief for cause. She scrolled to another document. Division G4 is Colonel Marcus Webb, but Webb doesn't have the authority to threaten relief of command. That comes from the division commander, Major General Frank Caldwell. I intercepted a classified message yesterday showing Caldwell sent aggregate readiness reports to Pentagon that were fabricated. He's been covering up equipment failures across 4 forward operating bases, not just Viper. Thornton's expression hardened. You're talking about charging a 2-star general with fraud and conduct unbecoming. That's going to require approval from the Secretary of the Army level. I know, Rachel said calmly. I've already notified my chain of command. The IG is sending a full investigation team, but I need Garrett and Kramer secured before division realizes how much I know. Caldwell will try to destroy evidence and discredit witnesses. We need to move fast. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Reynolds appeared at the entrance to the medical tent. His face was grim. Chief, we have a problem. Division just called. Colonel Andrew Brennan is inbound by helicopter. He's Caldwell's fixer, the lawyer who makes problems disappear. ETA 15 minutes. Rachel's jaw tightened. Let him come. I've transmitted everything to DC. He can't confiscate what he doesn't have. Thornton stood. I'm placing Colonel Garrett under house arrest pending formal charges. Sergeant Kramer is already in the medical facility under guard. We'll secure all physical evidence immediately. Master Sergeant Dockery, Rachel called across the tent. The old NCO approached his grandson, now sleeping peacefully behind him. I need you to gather your complete maintenance logs, everything you've documented over the past year. Paper copies, not digital. Division can't remotely delete paper. Dockery nodded. I've got copies in my quarters, kept them locked in my personal safe just in case. Old habits from when I learned not to trust the system. Good man, Rachel said. Get them now. Bring them to the command post. Agent Thornton will take custody. 20 minutes later, the helicopter appeared over the western perimeter, its navigation lights cutting through the gathering darkness. The UH-60 Blackhawk settled onto the landing pad with military precision, its rotors kicking up a fresh storm of dust and debris. Before the wheels had fully touched down, the side door slid open and a figure in pristine dress uniform emerged. Colonel Andrew Brennan moved with the aggressive confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating subordinates through sheer force of personality. He was flanked by 2 JAG officers carrying briefcases, their expressions schooled into professional neutrality. They strode toward the command post without hesitation, without checking in with base security, as if they owned the installation. Rachel met them at the entrance, her uniform still filthy from the rescue operation, her face streaked with dried sweat and dust. She stood blocking the doorway, her posture relaxed but immovable. Chief Warrant Officer Brennan, Colonel Brennan said, his voice carrying the sharp edges of East Coast education and legal training. I'm here on orders from Division Commander to assume control of the incident investigation and secure all evidence related to today's equipment failure. Colonel Brennan, Rachel replied, her tone polite and empty of inflection. This investigation is being conducted by the Inspector General's office under federal authority. Division has no jurisdiction. If you'd like to coordinate with the investigating team, you are welcome to submit a formal request through proper channels. Brennan's eyes narrowed. Chief, I don't think you understand the situation. General Caldwell has concerns about the integrity of your investigation. There are allegations of bias of predetermined conclusions. We're here to ensure everything is handled properly. Rachel smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Colonel, I have video evidence of Sergeant First Class Kramer assaulting a federal investigator in front of 500 witnesses. I have maintenance logs showing systematic fraud in readiness reporting. I have communications intercepts showing Colonel Garrett was ordered to falsify reports by division staff. And 2 hours ago, I transmitted all of that evidence to Inspector General Headquarters in Washington, D.C. She pulled out her satellite phone and held it up. Would you like me to call my commanding officer right now and have him explain to you in very small words why division doesn't get to investigate itself? Brennan's face flushed. You're making a serious mistake, Chief. General Caldwell is prepared to file obstruction charges against you. He has friends at the Pentagon. This could end your career. Colonel, Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than a shout. I have conducted 89 investigations. I have secured convictions against 3 generals, 14 colonels, and 47 field-grade officers. My record is spotless. My evidence is ironclad. And I have recordings of General Caldwell threatening to have me killed if I didn't drop this investigation. Brennan took a step back, his confident facade cracking. That's, you can't prove that. Rachel held up her phone again. Would you like to hear the recording? He called Colonel Garrett's personal line at 2200 hours last night. I was monitoring the call through a lawfully obtained wiretap authorized by a federal magistrate. The general said, and I quote, IG warrants can have accidents in the desert. Make sure she understands that, end quote. The color drained from Brennan's face. Behind him, the two JAG officers exchanged glances, their professional neutrality replaced by the look of lawyers realizing they just walked into a career-ending situation. That's threatening a federal officer. Rachel continued, her voice still conversational. That's a felony under Title 18, Section 111 of the U.S. Code. General Caldwell didn't just commit equipment fraud, he committed a federal crime. And you, Colonel Brennan, just attempted to interfere with a federal investigation. That's obstruction of justice, also a felony. Special Agent Thornton appeared at Rachel's shoulder, her CID credentials held up for Brennan to see. Colonel Brennan, I'm placing you under investigative detention pending review of your involvement in this matter. You and your staff will surrender your phones, laptops, and all materials related to division readiness reporting. Non-compliance will result in immediate arrest. Brennan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The calculation was visible on his face. Fight and risk criminal charges or cooperate and hope for leniency. I want to speak to my attorney. You have that right, Thornton agreed, but the phones are getting surrendered either way. Your choice is whether we do this professionally or in handcuffs. 20 minutes later, Colonel Brennan and his JAG officers were seated in the base legal office, their phones and laptops secured in evidence bags, their confident arrival transformed into stunned silence. Rachel stood outside the building, looking up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The storm had passed completely, now leaving the air clean and cool. Across the base, soldiers were returning to their duties. The crisis-managed life slowly returning to normal. But Rachel knew this was just the beginning. Within 48 hours, a full IG investigation team would arrive. Within a week, CID would have charges prepared against Garrett Kramer and half a dozen division staff officers. Within a month, congressional hearings would begin with Lieutenant Hammond's testimony and Rachel's evidence laid bare for the world to see. The system would fight back. It always did. Lawyers would argue technicalities. Public affairs officers would spin narratives. Senior officers would close ranks to protect their own. But none of it would matter. Rachel had the evidence. She had the witnesses. She had the truth. Master Sergeant Dockery approached through the darkness, moving more slowly now, the adrenaline of the day's crisis finally wearing off. Chief, my daughter just called. She's heard what happened. She wanted me to thank you. For Tyler. For all of them. Rachel nodded. Your grandson is a good soldier, Master Sergeant. He'll recover and go on to do great things. Make sure he learns from this. Make sure he understands that integrity matters more than advancement. I will, Dockery said. Then after a pause, what happens to me, I signed those false reports. I knew they were wrong, and I signed them anyway. You documented your protests, Rachel said. You logged every deficiency, every warning. You tried to work within the system, and when the system failed, you provided testimony. That's not complicity, Master Sergeant. That's courage. The IG will see it that way. And Garrett, Colonel Garrett will be court-martialed and dismissed from service. He'll lose his pension. He'll probably serve time. He made the choice to prioritize his career over his soldiers' lives. Now he gets to live with that choice. They stood in silence for a moment, two soldiers contemplating the wreckage of careers and the cost of principles. What about you, Chief? Dockery finally asked. Where do you go from here? Rachel pulled her tablet from her pocket and showed him the screen. A new assignment notification had arrived while she was dealing with Brennan. FOB, Rattlesnake, New Mexico. Reports of systematic maintenance fraud. A colonel with perfect readiness numbers and a reputation for not tolerating bad news. Same thing I always do, Rachel said. Find the truth, document it, make sure it can't be ignored. The next morning, FOB Viper assembled in formation for the last time under its old command structure. Colonel Elizabeth Calloway stood before them, 54 years old, with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for integrity that had survived 28 years of service. She had been selected by the IG to assume command pending the completion of the investigation. Soldiers of FOB Viper, Calloway's voice carried across the formation without artificial amplification. We have failed you. Your previous leadership prioritized statistics over your safety. They lied about readiness. They endangered your lives for the sake of their careers. That ends today. She gestured to Dockery, who stood at attention beside her. Master Sergeant William Dockery is hereby promoted to the rank of Command Sergeant Major and will serve as the senior enlisted advisor for this installation. His first order of business is to conduct a complete, honest assessment of every piece of equipment on this base. We will not deploy a single vehicle until it is truly mission ready. Not 98% ready, not good enough ready, actually ready. A murmur rippled through the formation. Soldiers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to believe what they were hearing. Effective immediately, Calloway continued, we are implementing new maintenance protocols. Every deficiency will be logged and addressed. No more editing digital records. No more pressure to make numbers look good. The only number that matters is the one that keeps you alive. She turned to face Rachel, who stood at the edge of the formation in her warrant officer rank, no longer disguised as a specialist. Chief Warrant Officer Brennan's investigation saved lives yesterday. It will save more lives in the coming months as we root out the corruption that has infected this command. She did her job with courage and integrity. That is the standard I expect from every soldier here. The formation was dismissed and soldiers scattered to their duties with a new energy, a sense that perhaps things might actually change. Rachel spent the rest of the day conducting exit interviews and transferring evidence custody to the incoming IG team. Lieutenant Hammond was officially reassigned to Fort Benning for additional training, his career suspended but not destroyed. Sergeant Kramer was formally charged and transferred to the detention facility at Fort Huachuca pending court-martial. As the sun began to set, Rachel found herself alone in the motor pool where this had all begun. The familiar sounds of maintenance surrounded her. The clang of tools, the hiss of compressed air, the voices of mechanics working with renewed purpose under Command Sergeant Major Dockery's watchful eye. She walked to the tool crib, a small building at the edge of the maintenance bay. Inside, rows of precision instruments hung on foam-lined walls, each one in its designated place. She selected a torque wrench, one of the high-end digital models that cost more than most soldiers made in a month. It was clean, well-maintained, properly calibrated. But Rachel pulled out a soft cloth anyway and began to clean it, her movements ritualistic and meditative. She wiped down the handle, the digital display, the socket head, removing dust that wasn't there, polishing metal that already gleamed. It was her ritual. After every investigation, after every confrontation with commanders and lawyers and the machinery of military bureaucracy, she came back to this. The simple, honest work of caring for tools. In a world of lies and politics and compromise, tools were pure. They worked or they didn't. They were calibrated or they weren't. There was no gray area, no spin, no narrative to construct. Master Sergeant Dockery found her there as the last light faded from the sky. He carried 2 cups of coffee, steam rising into the cool evening air. He handed one to Rachel without speaking, and they stood together in comfortable silence. They medevaced Kramer this afternoon, Dockery finally said. The surgeon at Fort Huachuca says his wrists will heal, but he'll never have full mobility again. Something about nerve damage from how precisely you damage the joint. Rachel continued cleaning the wrench. He'll have enough function for civilian life. That's more than he deserved. That was a hell of a thing, Chief, all of it. The takedown, the rescue, taking command without authority, going head-to-head with a division fixer. Dockery sipped his coffee. 90 investigations, you said. 90 after this one. How many have you lost? None. Dockery absorbed that. What's it cost you doing this work? Rachel was quiet for a long moment, her hands still moving across the wrench with methodical precision. I had a family once, a husband. That didn't survive this job. Too many deployments. Too many times I couldn't talk about what I was doing. Too many nights I came home and couldn't leave the work behind. She placed the perfectly clean wrench back in its foam cutout, securing it with a soft click. But every time I think about quitting, I remember Morrison. I remember his face when the explosion hit. The look in his eyes when he realized the equipment had failed just like we had warned it would. I remember promising myself that I'd make sure it never happened to anyone else. And has it happened to anyone else? Not on my watch, Rachel said quietly. 90 investigations, 90 installations fixed. How many soldiers didn't die because I found the lies before they became disasters? She shrugged. I'll never know. You can't count the deaths that don't happen. They stood in silence for a while longer, drinking coffee in the fluorescent-lit sanctuary of the tool crib. Outside, Phobe Viper continued its work, forever changed by 3 days of truth-telling. The next morning, a Black Hawk helicopter waited on the landing pad, rotors slowly spinning up. Rachel's gear was already loaded, her tablet secured in its case, her evidence transferred to the incoming IG team. She wore her warrant officer rank openly, now the 3 silver bars catching the early sunlight. Lieutenant Hammond approached as she was walking to the helicopter, moving carefully on crutches. He extended his hand, and in his palm was Morrison's challenge coin. Keep it, Lieutenant, Rachel said. You'll need it more than I will. Chief, I wanted to ask you something. When you knew I was complicit, when you knew I'd chosen career over integrity, why did you still save me? Why risk yourself for someone who didn't deserve it? Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Because you're 26 years old and you made a mistake. Morrison was 24 when he died. He deserved a second chance too. He didn't get one. You did. Don't waste it. She turned to walk away, but Hammond's voice stopped her one last time. What if I want to do what you do, investigate? Find the truth. Make sure this doesn't happen to other soldiers. Rachel smiled, and for the first time since arriving at Phobe Viper, it reached her eyes. Then apply to warrant officer school, study technical investigations, learn to read maintenance logs, the way priests read scripture, and remember that the system will fight you every day because the system doesn't want the truth. It wants compliance. She paused. But if you're willing to fight anyway, we could use people like you. The helicopter's rotors reached full speed, the pilot signaling readiness. Rachel walked across the tarmac, her stride steady and purposeful. Command Sergeant Major Dockery stood at attention nearby, rendering a perfect salute. She returned it with equal precision. As the helicopter lifted off, Rachel looked down at FO Viper, already shrinking beneath them. She could see soldiers moving between buildings, vehicles being serviced in the motor pool, the organized, purposeful activity of a military installation doing its work honestly for the first time in months. She pulled out her tablet and opened the file on her next assignment. FOB Rattlesnake, Colonel Michael Garrison, Commander. Readiness reports showing 97% mission capability. Supply requisitions showing chronic shortages of critical parts. The same pattern, always the same pattern. She scrolled through the initial intelligence package, her mind already categorizing, analyzing, planning. She would arrive as a specialist again. Another face in the crowd, another clerk from division that commanders could ignore, until she couldn't be ignored anymore. The helicopter banked west toward New Mexico, toward the next investigation. Rachel closed the file on FO Viper. That story was finished. The evidence secured, the commanders relieved, the soldiers protected. But the work was never done. There were always more bases, more commanders willing to trade lives for career advancement, more equipment failing because someone had decided that statistics mattered more than truth. And as long as that was true, Rachel Brennan would be there. Ghost warrant, silent investigator. The person who appeared when the numbers didn't add up and disappeared when the truth could no longer be denied. She pulled up a photograph on her tablet. Morrison smiling, young, alive. She touched the screen gently, a promise renewed. 90 down, she said quietly to the image. How many more until it stops? The desert scrolled beneath the helicopter, vast and empty and beautiful. Somewhere out there on another forward operating base, soldiers were climbing into vehicles that might kill them. Commanders were editing maintenance logs. NCOs were choosing between integrity and career. And Rachel Brennan was coming. The helicopter disappeared into the western sky, a dark speck against the morning sun. On the landing pad at Phobe Viper Command, Sergeant Major Dockery watched until it vanished completely. Then he turned and walked back to his motor pool, to his soldiers, to the work of rebuilding an honest organization from the wreckage of a corrupt one. Behind him on the side of the maintenance building, someone had already started a legend. Spray-painted in neat military stencil, letters, a message that would be repeated at bases across the desert. The ghost warrant was here. Tell the truth. It would become folklore. The mysterious specialist who appeared when commanders lied. The woman who broke a sergeant's wrists and saved an entire base. The investigator who couldn't be intimidated couldn't be bought, couldn't be stopped. Some would call it exaggeration, some would call it myth, but soldiers would remember. And some of them, when faced with the choice between integrity and advancement, would remember that someone was watching. Someone who cared more about truth than rank. Someone who would hold them accountable. And that Rachel knew as the helicopter carried her toward her next mission was worth more than 90 successful investigations. It was worth everything.